Hi, everybody. Wow, I can't believe that it's that time again. Betty, why do you have a blanket on?
Because there's mosquitoes everywhere, and I put on mosquito repellent or bug repellent, and it did not work.
You know what I think? Remember in the Old Testament stories that we looked at when Moses wanted to get all of the Israelites out of Egypt, and there were plagues that came? You remember that? Do you think one of the plagues was a mosquito?
Yes.
I think it must have been. And that would really bite. Oh, yuck. Now, let's see. Do we have one less tooth again? Now you're... Yeah. Okay, we're looking. We're watching those teeth, which is good. Maybe what you'll do is these pumpkins I brought you today from Nana and me, maybe you can carve one that looks just like your teeth now. What do you think? Would that be fun to carve one out like that? Well, the other thing is, I don't have the book with me today. Did I forget it?
No, we finished.
We finished the book last week. Do you remember what chapter it was?
20.
It was chapter 25. And why don't I have the book with me? Since we finished the book, how do we get a chapter 26?
You made one.
I made one because I'm writing the chapters now, aren't I? And the last time we were together, last week, and you were living inside a computer, I think, because I saw your face on there. How did you fit into that computer so that I could see your face?
It was very difficult.
I'll bet it was, and I'll bet you got hungry while you were living inside that computer.
I was in there for about 3 days.
Were you?
Without food.
Oh my, but you know what I did? I a few times. She got a little water.
Yeah,
right?
I did get some water.
Okay, that was good.
But it didn't taste very good.
No, I will improve it for the next time.
I was really hungry.
I'll bet you were hungry.
But I slept most of the time.
Most of the time you slept. Was there a particular app that you were sleeping in?
Where did I sleep? Oh, I was sleeping in, I don't know what it's called, but it's some type of music app.
A music app, so you were
I could
sleeping in
listen
there.
to the music
Oh, well, that was good. You had the music that you could listen to. And this week we're going to get started with somebody who had done something really amazing last week. Do you remember something? I'll give you a hint.
David?
Yeah, what did he do? He killed somebody who was a giant, and the giant's name was Goliath. Goliath. You got it right there. But then there was something else. They couldn't just leave the poor big man there. What happened next was David came down holding what?
A sword?
Well, he had a sword, didn't he? And what did the sword do with Goliath?
Cut his head.
So when David came back down, he was carrying a...
Head.
Must have looked like a jack-o'-lantern. Just in time for Halloween.
It was probably like...
Oh, I imagine it was. That's probably the look that it had. Yeah, just like that. And you may remember that the king at that time was a man by the name of Saul.
Yeah.
So let's find out what happens.
He was supposed to be the king,
Yeah.
and then something happened.
Yeah, that's what we're going to find out today.
Oh, wait.
This is chapter... Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. What are we looking at there? Oh, you going to show everybody? Okay. Bishop's Bible Stories for Betty and Friends.
So, and then it's BBBF.
Oh my goodness. So will we be BBFs or BFFs? Let's find out.
BBBF.
I like it. Well, let's see what we can do now. Because when we last thought about David, he had just handed over the head of the Philistine superhero Goliath to Saul. Even though David had only been a shepherd in Bethlehem, after David handed Goliath's head to Saul, Saul decided that David needed to stay with him, not go back to his daddy Jesse in Bethlehem. No more sheep herding for David. Saul had a son named Jonathan, and in no time at all, David and Jonathan became BFFs. Yeah, they did. In fact, Jonathan liked David so much that he gave him his own super long jacket, t-shirt, fancy belt with a big belt buckle, a sword, his bow, and his arrow. Gave him everything. Usually shepherds didn't need all that. Saul even promoted David and made him the lieutenant colonel of his army. Kind of like one of the big shots in the army, an officer. And on their way home, David and the army found many women coming out to sing welcome home songs. One song really was lots of fun to sing. They sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Well, yeah, and you could set it to a different tune. Well, you'd think that Saul would have liked that song since he was the one that made David an army officer, but no, sir. Saul became very jealous, and every time he looked at David, he remembered that song from the top 10 list, and he hated it, because that song was all about how David had killed more people than Saul had. Well, one day, one day David was practicing his music on his harp, which he had 150 psalms to write and sing, and Saul always had a spear in his hand, and he hated the music so much, but really was jealous. Well, it's like a sword. Throw it like that. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And so anyway, he was practicing, but Saul always had a spear in his hand, and he hated the music so much, but really was jealous of David, so he threw the spear at David.
What happened?
Well, actually, Saul tried to do that 2 times, but David was able to duck really well. No, he saw the spear coming, and he went like this, just like that.
I thought when you duck, it's like this.
Well, probably, but anything you do,
It could be like
because
this,
yep,
or this.
because David, being a shepherd, was in great
Or
shape.
If you're like this, you
Uh-huh.
could be like,
Yeah, he could do that too.
like that would be fun.
It would be, yeah,
It'd be really fun.
ducking from the spear.
Dancing duck.
That's what it is.
It's the dancing duck.
That only made Saul more angry and more jealous, and he said, I want to pin David up against the wall.
Why?
But the problem for Saul was that he knew that God was with David. So Saul gave David another promotion, and he made him a general in the army and sent him away along with 1,000 soldiers. And instead of being happy that the Israelites now had fewer enemies, Saul became even more angry and jealous, and he became more afraid of David. Look at your eyes. Now that's what I call shocked eyes right there. And because Saul knew that God was with David, but the problem was that everyone in Israel and Judah loved David. And Saul wanted everybody to love himself. Saul had a plan. He went to David and said, I want you to marry my eldest daughter, Merab.
Huh?
David was a bit nervous. Merab. King Saul said, you know what? David, I want you to marry my eldest daughter, Merab.
I thought he didn't like David.
Well, he didn't, but he thought maybe he could trick him. So David was a bit nervous about becoming Saul's son-in-law. But David didn't have to marry Merab because she married somebody else named Adriel. So David didn't have her as his wife. Now, there was another problem. Saul had a really cute daughter named Michal, and she was in love with David already. Saul thought if David married Michal, she could help her daddy trap David.
There's a mailman.
Saul was thinking that if his daughter Michal and David were husband and wife, the Philistines would really want to kill them to get back at Saul.
Why?
Well, because that way, if they could trap them, you see, then Saul might be able to trap them.
Wait, why don't they like Saul?
Well, his enemies didn't like him. Because they wanted to have everything Saul had. So, Saul knew that David might once again tell him that he was not worthy to be Saul's son-in-law. And so Saul told his servants to try and convince David that marrying Michal proved that Saul was pleased with David. David, however, told the servants, this is a really big deal to be Saul's son-in-law. And my daddy Jesse is not rich, and I'm not rich. And not that many people know me anyway. See, in those days.
Wait, David?
Yeah, yeah. But in those days, the bridegroom had to give money to the bride's dad in order to marry the daughter. It was something that was done back then. Yeah, it's called a dowry. So, Saul said, no problem. I know. Have him go and do to 100 Philistine men what all little boys when they are born, and that is called circumcision, and that's all I'm going to say to you. Grown men don't like it. Saul, well, they don't like circumcision, and another day I'll explain that. Well, it's how you knew that a little boy was a Jewish little boy. So Saul figured that the Philistine men would be so hopping mad that they would kill David. David agreed, and he went out and killed 200 Philistines, and he had the proof. Probably he carried them in a bucket. Now, Saul was really stuck. David did exactly what Saul told him to do, but God protected David, and so David was to marry Michal. It must have been a strange wedding reception, because Saul was even more afraid of his new son-in-law and decided that David would be his enemy forever. David did a great job as the general, and even the enemies of Israel heard all about him. In fact, David and his army beat up more enemies than any of Saul's other generals did. So, David and his army became very famous. Saul became even more jealous of David, so he went to his son Jonathan and his servants and told him to kill David. Now, you know that David and Jonathan were BFFs, right? So Jonathan said to his buddy David, tomorrow morning go and hide in the field. And then my dad and I will go to the field, and I will find out what he has to say about you. Well, Jonathan did his best when he talked to his daddy about David. He reminded Saul about all the good things that David had done for Saul and the Israelites. It seems that Saul loved his son Jonathan enough to listen to him. So Saul said, okay, I promise to God that I will not kill him. When Saul left the field, Jonathan called, hey buddy, I got some good news for you. When David stopped playing hide and seek, he talked with Jonathan and felt a lot better. So everything went back to normal. And David kept on fighting all the enemies for Saul. The Philistines were so scared that when they saw David, they ran away. Yeah. Do you remember the last time that David was playing his harp and Saul had a spear in his hand? Yeah. Well, it happened again. And this time David flew the coop. You know what that means? He got out of there as fast as he could. It seems that sometimes Saul would get these evil thoughts and get in a really bad mood without any warning. Saul decided to hunt down David the next day, and he sent some men to David and Michal's house, or Michal's, to find David. But before the men got there, Michal had already told her husband David about her daddy's evil plan to kill him, and she said, run for your life.
It's Michal.
Yeah. So, that night, before the men came, Michal helped her husband drop down from the second-story window of their house, and he ran as fast as he could. Michal then played a trick on the men. She placed an idol, a statue, on the bed. She put some goat's hair, like a wig, and covered up the statue. When the men got there and wanted to see David, Michal said, sorry, he's sick in bed. Well, the men didn't want to kill a sick man in bed, so they went back to Saul and told him. Saul didn't say, oh, I hope he gets better. No, he said to the men, go back there, bring me David on his bed, and then I will kill him myself. So when the men went back to David's bedroom, they saw then that somebody had played a trick on them. Saul was really upset with his daughter for tricking him. He almost didn't really know what to say.
Did she get grounded?
Ooh, she probably got grounded. I think it's probably true.
She'd probably be a ground.
Yeah, probably a grown woman, but not very old. They married kind of young back then. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, besides, her daddy was the king. After all, she loved her daddy and she loved her husband. So back to David. When he ran away, he went to Samuel, and the two of them went to visit a friend while David explained what had happened. Someone saw the three of them and went to Saul to tell him where David was hanging out in a place called Naioth at Ramah. So Saul sent his soldiers there to capture David, but when they got there, they saw a bigger group of people along with David and Samuel. And those men were talking about God. They were prophets. The next thing you know, the Holy Spirit got into the soldiers, and they started talking about God too. Now Saul was really upset. So he sent more soldiers, and guess what? Same thing happened to them. They started talking about God, and they were really excited. Now Saul was really mad, so he sent another group of men, and the same thing happened. So there were a lot of men standing around praying out loud and talking with excitement about God. It was like a big prayer group. Well, Saul was so upset that he decided to do the job himself. So when he stopped off on the way to Ramah to get a drink of water in a place called Siku, in those days there was not bottled water yet. Did you know that? Yeah. So he asked the other thirsty people if they knew where Samuel and David were.
So they just had to use cups?
No, something like cups, but oftentimes they cup their hands to drink. And they would have to go down inside the well. Yep.
Oh, I thought
So,
like they used like a type of like a type like grass and leaves to
No,
like hay.
not so
to
much.
make like a cup.
Well, you know what? They probably did make something like ceramic like that, so you might be right there with all the mud and the grass. You have to check that out. That's a good thought.
Maybe mud. I didn't say mud.
Well, like I said, it was like a big prayer group. Well, Saul was so upset that he decided to do the job himself, so he went there. He asked the other thirsty people if they knew where Samuel and David were. Apparently they were talking about the prayer meeting. So they told Saul, they're over in Naioth at Ramah. By this time, the Holy Spirit filled up Saul, and he was walking to Ramoth at Ramah, and while he was doing it, he started talking out loud and getting excited about God. Well, sir, when that happened, Saul got there, he took off his coat, he lay on the ground, he joined the prayer meeting. Later on, this is why... Well, yeah, but they probably had some coats they put down. That's what he did. He put his coat down first, he lay on the ground, he joined the prayer meeting, and later on, this is why some people ask, is Saul all... Because he was talking out loud.
They would like use wood and stuff
When,
to make chairs.
when they were there for a time, but they were on the move right now. But David was scared when he saw Saul coming, and he ran away again, and this time he ran to his BFF Jonathan's house. David was very confused. He could not even imagine what he had done to make Saul hate him so much. So he asked Jonathan if he had any idea why his dad hated him so much. Jonathan told David not to worry. Jonathan said to David, "My dad tells me everything. Don't fret over this." But David was still worried. He told Jonathan that since Saul knew that they were best buds, that Saul might be hiding his plans to kill David from Jonathan because he didn't want to upset Jonathan. In fact, said David, I am one step away from being killed by your dad. That's what David said to Jonathan. I'm one step away by your dad killing me. Jonathan understood David's fear and told him, I'll do whatever you want. So, David reminded Jonathan that the next day was the big new moon festival. Yeah, and that Saul wanted David to sit with him at the king's high table. That made David nervous. So he told Jonathan he thought it might be a good idea for him to go back to playing hide and seek. But David told Jonathan, if your dad asks where I am, just tell him that I went back to my hometown of Bethlehem. That's his hometown.
Like he should go back.
Yeah.
Like he actually just like, if he has a house, just like.
Yeah, because he had relatives there.
Sell it and go back.
Well, I don't know what kind of real estate agents they had back then. So, he says to him, I'm going to go and meet for our big yearly sacrifice in honor of the clan. David continued, if he says, no big deal, then I'm safe. But if he blows his top when you know he's out to get me. David became really serious and said, "So, since we are blood brothers, and I have to die, I'd rather you kill me yourself rather than have your dad kill me."
Wait.
So David says to Jonathan, "If I'm going to get killed anyway, I'd rather have my friend kill me than your old man."
Why?
Well, just because that way it wouldn't be as upsetting for him, because he could see his friend's face rather than this angry Saul. Jonathan was surprised and told David, "Nah, if my dad wanted to kill you, I'd tell you." But David was worried that if Saul was really angry, who would tell David about it? Jonathan thought it would be a good idea to go back to the field just like before. Once they got there, Jonathan told David that by the same time, the day after tomorrow, he'd know the answer to the question. Jonathan told David, "You can count on me, brother. In fact, go to the big stone called SAUL. I will take my bow and arrows with me because I have a plan. When I shoot 3 arrows, if they go to one," said, "I send a boy to get the arrows and tell him to bring back the arrow. That's the signal you're safe. But if I shoot the arrows beyond the stone,"
Can I read some?
and tell the boy that the arrow is beyond them, then
The signal that you are safe. But if I shoot the arrows beyond the stone and tell the boy that the arrow is beyond, then I suggest that you run as fast as your legs can.
So you get the idea? That's the signal. It depends upon where the arrows go as to whether he's supposed to run away, David's supposed to run away, or whether David is safe.
Oh, no.
So, back to the big barbecue. Saul noticed that David was missing the first night, but figured that he hadn't cleaned up properly, so he ignored it. However, the next night, Saul saw that David was missing again, so he said something about it to Jonathan, who told him the story about David going to be with the kinsfolk in Bethlehem. I gave him permission. By now you know that Saul was a hothead, and he took his anger out on his own son Jonathan. In fact, he was so angry with his own son that he threw a spear at him.
What?
Yeah. Jonathan was surprised and asked his dad why he was so upset with David. And boy, was he angry with his dad, Saul. Jonathan was so upset that he lost his appetite.
Wait, so he tried to kill him?
His own son. I told you, this Saul gets to be a real hothead.
What's a hothead?
Gets angry really easily. So,
Yeah, because it's like your head gets red
yeah,
when you're really mad.
that's true.
Right.
Well, you know what happened next?
Can you do?
You're going to take care of a mosquito?
I saw that. I
Well, don't-
thought there was some
Let's find out what happened. Well, do you know what happened next? Jonathan went to the field, shot the 3 arrows beyond the rock, and after a quick goodbye and some tears, David knew he had to run. Jonathan told David, "Go in peace," just like the deacon does at the end of Mass, "Go in peace." And Jonathan reminded David that they would still be best friends forever.
Oh wait, is that how the priest do that?
Yeah. So then, go in peace. And so David ran off, and Jonathan went back home. And the next time we get together for this story, we're going to try and figure out where David ran. Where
I think
did he go?
Let's predict.
Let's predict. What do you think?
I think he went to Bethlehem
Let's check it out next.
and
Yeah.
went to see he lived with his relatives.
So you think he went to Bethlehem, so you go live with his relatives. Okay. Well, the next
What do you
time,
think?
I think that's reasonable. Here's what we're going to do. When we get together next time, we are going to find out where he went. What do you think?
Okay.
All right, would you like to say goodbye to everybody? Thanks so much for joining in today. Don't forget to be safe. Remember, lots of love. That's Betty waving.
That's my hand.
Go ahead.
Bye-bye.
Bye.